Well, how very nice to see you all. Thank you so much for tuning in. This short film tells of the goings-on in Wirksworth just before, during, and after the Civil War. The main characters are: one, the man who built in 1631 the house which was restored by the Derbyshire Historic Buildings Trust in the 1980s, is now our HQ and where our board will be meeting tomorrow morning. Two, the vicar of St Mary's Church in Wirksworth, who was the vicar in the 1630s, who was a disgrace to his calling. And three, Sir John Gell, the head of a local gentry family, who was an equally nasty bit of work. It's really a rather shocking story that's going to be told. At the end of the film, I will be very happy to try and answer any questions you may have. So here we go with the film.
We've come to Wirksworth today to talk about the gentry, the 17th century gentry, bashing each other up and scrapping and quarrelling, and also to talk about Wirksworth as a town which in the 1950s was in a state of near dereliction.
And this was one of the most extreme examples of that dereliction. This building was listed in 1950 as a ruin. Its roof had fallen in the 1940s. The Derbyshire Historic Buildings Trust did the research, discovered it was built by someone called William Hopkinson. He was from a gentry family, but he made his money from lead mining and also by bashing up reluctant payers of tithes. He was in cahoots with the vicar here. So the vicar got him to head up a bunch of thugs to go around bashing up people who wouldn't pay their tithes.
Yeah, and this town built on the lead mining industry. It's all about lead here.
Right back to Roman times, lead was what created the wealth here. And William Hopkinson got his money from lead. He owned lead mines up here. A characteristic of the 17th century houses here was the use of decorative plasterwork. Now that was either done in raised plasterwork or using a timber kind of pattern, pushing it into the wet plaster, so you got decorative motifs. What survived from the ruins of Hopkinson's house was the date, miraculously, of 1631 and this rather beautiful bird, which is one of these butterpress type patterns pushed into wet plaster. So this is the front door to William Hopkinson's high status building, and in fact is the front door to his high hall chamber. This was the hall chamber of the house. We know from half tax returns of the 17th century that the 6 hearths here represented the biggest house in Wirksworth. He obviously came a cropper financially, because we know from the will and probate inventory of his mother that by the time she died, she owned the property. So she must have bailed him out of some financial difficulty. That probate inventory reveals that at the time of her death, there were 41 beds in this building. That's a hell of a lot of beds. I mean, some were truckle beds underneath proper feather beds, but nevertheless,
So a lot of people.
lot of people. Nevertheless, later on in the 1640s and 1650s, he regained his financial position. And in fact, the whole family were doing well at the time of the Restoration. And his brother George, who was a lawyer, was doing sufficiently well to be granted a coat of arms from the College of Heralds. So the family were going up in status.
And his brother was also barmaster.
His brother was barmaster.
And I think that's we need to unpack this hierarchy of the lead mining industry. If we start at the very top, we've got the king as Lord of the Manor of Wirksworth, the Duchy of Lancaster.
The King's Field.
The King's Field has a claim over all mineral rights in Wirksworth, appoints a barmaster who is responsible for making sure the king is getting his skim off the top, a deputy barmaster who is the man on the ground, he's doing all the hard work. The barmaster's a more ceremonial title. And then there is this Barmote court, 25 people appointed to act as juries in the times of disputes between the miners.
Still meets in Wirksworth once a year.
Yeah, a continuing legacy. A steward of this Barmote court who's supposed to be totally independent of the king, of the barmaster, the deputy barmaster, and intervenes and to provide impartiality. And then right at the bottom of all of this, the lead miners themselves, who are the ones digging and extracting the lead.
And you had the independent lead miners and then the employees. And William Hopkinson employed men to mine his land up here.
So many layers of interest in this.
Yeah,
In this.
a complicated hierarchy.
Yeah. This impressive panorama, standing up here and looking down on this roofscape of the historic buildings of Wirksworth, and all of it built out of the wealth and prosperity of the lead industry.
And the lead industry here goes way back. There was an inquiry in 1288 into the origins of the laws and customs of lead mining here. And that inquiry revealed the fact, and I quote from the inquiry, the origins of them go back to time out of memory of man in 1288.
I mean, that's the Norman conquest, which we think about as a very long time ago, and they're talking about it.
Time out of memory of man.
So this is something which has been in this, the lead mining has been here for a long, long time.
Goes back to Roman times.
Yeah, back to the Romans. And it's an interesting quirk that British history, throughout British history, there's always been this sanctity of property rights and land ownership and how that cannot be touched. And yet here you have the Duchy of Lancaster, the king, as Lord of the Manor. So it doesn't matter whether you are gentry, aristocrats, whatever you own, if a miner discovers lead ore on your land, they have a right to sink a shaft and extract.
Yes. There were three exceptions to that. It couldn't be done in a graveyard or in an orchard or in a garden, but otherwise you just go ahead and sink a shaft.
Because the king has this right to the minerals.
Because it's a royal manor and the crown has the rights to the minerals.
And I like thinking of the gentry with their estates and their land in the 17th century, thinking, how dare you touch my land? But these miners could go in there and do what they wanted.
Yes.
And just looking across the town below us now, we can see so many important buildings from the history of the lead mining.
Yes, I mean, here's one in front of us, Babington House, built or rebuilt in the 17th century. And it's a very handsome building, isn't it? With beautiful Derbyshire stone slates and carboniferous limestone, built from the actual quarry, the quarry face just below us here.
Yeah. And you could spend a whole morning just looking across the different buildings and talking about the relevance to the history of the lead mining industry. But of course, one of the centres of authority here was the church.
Yes.
So shall we go down there?
There it is.
And have a look at some of the local notables and their tombs?
Let's go and look at the gel tombs.
We've met the Hopkinsons, and now it's time to meet another local notable family in the parish church of Wirksworth with the Gell family. So we've got Anthony Gell, Wraith Gell,
and Sir John.
And Sir John is the protagonist of this story because it's Sir John who, again, this Gell family have significant rights over lead and own several lead mines.
That's where their wealth came from, which provided the wealth for Anthony to found this school and the almshouses. But William Hopkinson, who was acting for the vicar at that time, Robert Carrier, who was a particularly rapacious man who wanted every penny out of the tithe that he was due. And so Sir John was not paying his tithe. So Robert Carrier got William Hopkinson and his bunch of thugs to go and persuade Sir John with a threat of violence to pay up. But Sir John had an even bigger bunch of thugs who bashed up William Hopkinson and his thugs.
Robert Carrier's also member of the gentry, the vicar, and his wife was quite hostile.
She was equally rapacious, and she, on one occasion, actually threatened a lead miner at the head of his shaft with a dagger, saying, "It is a matter of life or death for you to pay up." And this was all reported to the agents of the Crown.
So they end up in hot water right at the top of the food chain in the Star Chamber, the King's Court.
They were tried in the King's Court and ultimately sent to the Fleet prison in London. So the vicar was dispossessed of his living.
All of this going on, bubbling under the surface just before the English Civil War.
A time of great trouble.
So you've got the parliamentarians, the royalists and the gentry are taking sides, and Sir John Gell with the parliamentarians, and still doing business in the lead mining with royalists throughout the Civil War.
Business is important, Nothing stops business. But Gell was a very violent man, and he really went round. He actually married by force one of the gentry's wife, because he'd just taken over, really.
But ended up in the Tower?
Well, he was discovered at one point having considered what might happen with the Restoration. So he sent a message to Charles I, who was by then imprisoned in Carisbrooke Castle on the Isle of Wight, and sent a message to him saying he could provide £900 in gold if he needed it. And the parliamentary forces discovered this message, and so he was put in jail by the parliament.
He's a chancer.
He was a chancer.
But all the way throughout this, they continue to get their dues from the lead mining industries. And they both pull through. Hopkinson pulls through, Sir John pulls through, and they make it out the other side of the Civil War.
Charles II forgave Gell and gave him a post in court.
We're in the churchyard, so we have to talk about the tithes. The tithes being 1/10 of your produce, which historically, pre-Reformation, had to go to the church.
And the tithe brought in a lot of money, especially here because of the tithe on the lead mining. As late as 1852, just one lead mine in 1 year brought in £1,200 for the vicar. Now, in modern day terms, that's about 160,000. It's a lot of money, and that's just one lead mine.
And the vicar using that money to pay for the rebuilding of the vicarage.
That vicar in 1853 took down the rambling old Elizabethan vicarage, built a new Georgian polite vicarage with a lawn where the old vicarage had been, and then created this perimeter walk because he thought it was very improper for people to crisscross the churchyard anywhere and to put their washing out as a drying green here. And so he actually paid for the creation of this railed perimeter walk.
Yeah. And it must have been so frustrating for anyone involved in the lead mining industry, the miners having to let go of 1/10 of their dues to the church. I mean, after the Reformation, a lot of the gentry acquired the rights to the tithe, so it was the gentry themselves who were receiving the money from the tithe.
Creaming it off.
Yeah, and Hopkinson being one of them who...
Hopkinson went round with his thugs extracting the money from reluctant payers.
Yeah.
Gentry violence in Wirksworth.
Yeah. And the tithe, something in the 1830s, the government recognised something needed to be done about kind of this difficulty of creaming off 1/10 of all your produce, and so they commuted it to a form of payment, the Tithe Commutation Act 1836, and it just became a cold hard exchange of cash.
Yeah.
We've been strolling around Wirksworth, which is now this charming town full of artists and has this very creative atmosphere. But by the 20th century, this place was really in decline.
It was spectacularly in decline because the economic base had disappeared. The lead mining was no longer profitable. That had been replaced by a textile mill and by quarrying. But the quarrying had terrific impacts. The quarry came very close into the town centre, just up the dale, literally a stone's throw away. Stones were flying everywhere, dust everywhere. In fact, the dust was so bad in the town centre that the butcher had to get his lad to come out with a bucket of water and throw it over the sides of beasts twice a day to get rid of the dust. That's how bad it was.
I suppose everyone's probably vegan nowadays. But this building, Hopkinson's house, was in a terrible state as well. How did it get like that?
This was absolutely ruinous when it was listed in 1950. The roof had fallen in the 40s, and its decline really started in 1750 when its garden was taken by the man who built the house in the marketplace, who bought this house in order to take its garden for himself.
And that's the steward of the Duchy of Lancaster, who is the king.
He represented the lord of the manor. The lord of the manor was the king.
So you do what you like if you
Absolutely, he was in charge, top dog.
Let's go and have a look at his house then. We can't come to Wirksworth without hearing how Barry Joyce MBE earned his title. So how did that come about?
Well, it was partly my contribution to this regeneration project here that started in 1978. It was very early idea of using conservation as an engine for social and economic regeneration.
So it's one of the earliest heritage-led regeneration schemes.
Very early and quite influential.
Yeah, and this is one of the houses you saved, perhaps?
Well, this is one of the buildings that was in extreme state of disrepair, and the Derbyshire Historic Buildings Trust restored it. It's a long story, but basically the stonework was literally falling off. So actually all the stonework had to be replaced. One of the great supporters of the project was the late Duchess of Devonshire, and she used to ask me...
Chatsworth House.
Of Chatsworth. And she used to ask me to occasionally give her a tour around to see how we were doing. And she wanted to... We were standing over there, and she pointed to this building and said, "Why aren't you doing that one? It's in a terrible state." And I said, "Well, it's lived in by a very elderly lady, and we don't want to disturb her. We'll wait for her successor before we do it." By that time we were walking up and she was peering into this room here, and the owner was asleep on a chaise lounge underneath with her arms crossed, and she was like this. And the Duchess, in that very strong Mitford 1930s voice that she had, said, "Oh, but she's dead. She's quite dead. I think it's terribly cruel of you leaving her here mouldering like that." And at this point, the woman woke up, so we had to walk away.
Okay, Barry, I don't know if there's anyone would like to unmute with any questions. You're on mute yourself, Barry.
Okay. Well, I'm very happy to answer any questions if there are any.
You've got gallery view.
Gallery view.
There.
Gallery view, yes, then you can see everyone,
this one here.
or anyone who's got their camera on.
Oh,
Can you hear me all right?
Tens and millions of people.
Or feel free to type in the chat box and I can read them out if you'd rather.
That would be good, Lucy, thank you. I should have, just to say, I should have in my introduction mentioned my co-presenter, Toby Ebbs, who is a historian and an independent conservation expert.
See if we're there. Can I ask a question, please?
You may.
Right. Well, I think two questions. When you were saying about Anthony Gell, not Anthony, the other one, John, was it? Forcibly marrying someone.
Yes.
Was that a bigamist marriage? Because did you say?
No, you're quite right. I should have explained that. He went to Elveston Castle, where the Earl of Hartington had recently died, and his widow, the Countess, was the remaining person at the castle in charge of Elveston Castle. And Sir John Gell must have taken a fancy to her. She didn't take a fancy to him, but he went into the church and desecrated her late husband's tomb, and then forcibly married her. I mean, it just does show what an absolute brute that man was.
Yeah. Thank you.
It was extraordinary that he should change sides so successfully each time. I mean, he was made a baronet by Charles I. Within less than a year after that, he became a general for the parliamentary forces. And then, as I explained in the film, when he realized that the parliamentarians may not be doing terribly well, he sent this message to Charles I saying, well, I could turn, by implication, saying I could turn sides and I can send you £900 in gold. But of course, that message was accepted by the by the parliamentarians, and he himself ended up in prison. But quite remarkably, at the Restoration, Charles II forgave him and gave him a post at court. The Vicar of Bray, and well, before the Vicar of Bray, but yes. Any other questions?
Can I ask a second one while other people are thinking? So, kind of what became of them? Hopkinson, Hopkinson, the vicar, and and Gell. I mean, did they thrive and prosper throughout the rest of their life, or
the Gells did? The Gells thrived and prospered, and they became even greater figures during the Restoration. And as I say, he was given a place at court, and no, they did very well. William Hopkinson and his brother George also did very well. after the restoration of the monarchy at the end of the parliamentary period, and prospered. But the vicar and his wife, I haven't been able to find what happened to them after they were banged up in the Fleet prison. But I presume they didn't do terribly well.
Thank you.
It's quite interesting that their case was dealt with by the Star Chamber, because normally a episode like this in a town a long way from London would never get to the Star Chamber. But the reason it got to the Star Chamber, I'm pretty certain, is because there was a danger of it messing up the revenues going to the Crown. Charles I was having a great deal of problem getting Parliament to vote him funds. Parliament not constantly, but repeatedly refused to vote funds for the king. So the king had to depend on income sources which were not, which did not go through the parliamentary route. And one of these was the profits, or the creaming off of the profits from the lead mines of Wirksworth. And happily for Charles I, at that time, it was a mini boom in the lead mining industry in Wirksworth, where the gang mine was being exploited. And the gang mine was a particularly profitable mine. And so he was getting substantial funds from the lead mining in Wirksworth to keep him afloat. Any other questions?
Hi, Barry. Robert Reed here.
Hello, Robert.
Hi. Thoroughly enjoyed your talk and the film. And of course, I remember well visiting Hopkinson's house when work was in progress, and how carefully the building was stitched together. I just wondered if you wanted to explain a little bit more about the logistics of how you went about getting the work finished.
Yes, well, thank you, Robert, for that prompt. Yes, well, there are two people who should be given particular tribute for that achievement. One is Derek Latham, who is currently the chairman of the Derbyshire Historic Buildings Trust, who at that time was the technical advisor. And he had the job of finding a solution to this very challenging problem of how do you deal with a building in such an extreme state of dereliction. Well, the first challenge was to secure ownership of the building. The owner was the man who lived in what had been built by the steward of the Barmote Court in the 1750s. So he lived in that house facing the marketplace. The reason he owned it was because it had never gone out of that parcel after it had been bought in 1750 in order for the garden of Hopkinson's house to become the garden of the 1750s house. And the owner in the 1980s actually kept his car in a garage in part of the ground floor of the ruined Hopkinson's house. So it was a benefit to him as a car park, if nothing else. And he was not terribly enamored of the idea of giving up ownership of the building. Certainly on the face of it, who were these people offering to take it off his hands and restore it as a usable building? Well, Derek Latham carried out a feasibility study, a kind of options appraisal of what kind of uses would be the most appropriate and successful for its sustainable use once it was re-roofed and repaired as a structure. And that study showed that the optimum use was as offices. As offices, it could remain relatively unaltered internally without too much subdivision. If it had been converted for residential use, there would have had to have been massive intervention. But as a suite of offices, it was possible to really reinstate the floors and, of course, the roof, and put in water and heating and lighting with otherwise relatively little alteration into the shell of the ruined part. One bay had retained its roof, and so that was pretty much intact. As an office, it was possible to make sure there was no overlooking from the building onto the garden of the 1750s house, because part of the agreement was that all those windows should be obscured glass. So there was no overlooking. Eventually, the owner was persuaded. I think there was some agreement that if there was any profit from the exercise, then the profit should be shared. Well, we knew very well there would be no profit. In fact, the whole project was very dependent on a very generous degree of grant from various sources, partly from the Sainsbury family, partly from English Heritage. So that credit needs to go to Derek Latham, really, for that basic strategic success. Then credit needs to go to the job architect, Anthony Rossi, who was an employee of Derek Latham and Associates. And Anthony Rossi was an extraordinarily clever and ingenious conservation architect who worked on site with the builders, really as not just architect, but clerk of works. And he would be there much of the time doing little sketches to show the builders how rotten lintels could either be replaced or reinforced, how doors could be reinforced so the stone lintels could be supported. It was a matter of lovingly stitching the ruin back together again so it stood up well. And Anthony Rossi did the most splendid job. Anthony went on to be recognised as a major figure in British conservation, architectural conservation. And he was also very generous with his time. He was for many years sat in a voluntary capacity on the Derby Diocesan Advisory Committee, which advised the bishop on matters of Anglican church buildings in Derbyshire. He himself was a Roman Catholic and did a lot of voluntary work for the Roman Catholic Church, and was actually made a papal knight. He was also recognised by Her Majesty the Queen when he was made a commander of the British Empire. So he was a personal friend of mine. He was a lovely man. And sadly, Derek and I, 2 years ago, travelled to Norfolk, to Norwich, which was his hometown, to attend his memorial service in the Roman Catholic Cathedral at Norwich.
Oh, sorry to hear that. I did know him, yes.
I hope that answers your question, Robert.
Yeah, thank you very much, Barry.
Thank you for the prompt.
Well, it was an exciting and interesting exercise.
It was indeed. It was, and pretty unusual, I think, isn't it, for a building in such a bad state. I should also have explained all those images of the facade actually show really the 1780s remodeling of the building, because after the steward of the Barnet Court had bought Hopkinson's house, he then split it into 3 dwellings. And so the windows you see are really 1780 windows. Only a few of the 17th century built windows survive in any form at all.
Which is the Venetian windows.
The Venetian windows are 1780 windows.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Great job.
Any more questions for Barry?
When's your next talk, Barry?
That's probably
Yeah.
it. Oh, go
I
on.
just wondered, just again, when's your next talk, Barry?
Oh no, that's it for this year.
Oh, well,
We've yet to publish our programme for next year.
I was actually just going to say our Christmas event, a Dickensian-inspired DHBT Christmas Carol. There are actually tickets still available for the Saturday night, which is being held at Hopkinson's house. So if this has inspired you to want to have a look, please head to our Eventbrite page or our website, 7 o'clock on Saturday, the 17th of December.
And that will be held in a room with a magnificent 17th century Inglenook fireplace.
Yeah.
Reason alone to go.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Just sorry again, Barry. One quick question. The plasterwork I was interested in, partly because I'm writing a piece about pargeting and plasterwork.
Oh yes.
And because I was fascinated by the plaster ceiling in Marsden's.
Yes.
And the lady kindly gave me your email. And I've not had a chance to give you to contact you because I understand you know a bit about that.
Well, I was intrigued by it, and there is a plaster specialist whose name escapes me for the moment, who actually at one point lived in a building restored by the Derbyshire Historic Buildings in Marlborough. And I have raided his mind, his brain about this plaster work, because I suspected there was a band of itinerant plasterers, because those of, if you know Haddon Hall, there is plasterwork in Haddon Hall very, very similar to the plasterwork in the building called Marsden's in Wirksworth Marketplace, which is a very elaborate raised rich pattern of vines and roses in very beautiful plasterwork, set in 4 coved panels in the ceiling. And I wondered whether perhaps the same troupe of plasterers that worked at Haddon had been active in Wirksworth. There are 3 buildings in Wirksworth with very beautiful plasterwork of the same period, as well as Marsden's. The Hope and Anchor on its first floor has a ceiling very similar to that of Marsden's.
All right.
And the building in Coldwell Street, which is now called the Old Manor House. It was never actually a manor house. That's a rather confusing name. But anyway, that building also has plasterwork of the same date. In addition to that, some houses have these butter press type of decorative plasterwork. So I think there must have been a troupe of plasterers going around in probably the 1630s, about the same time Hopkinson's house was built, who were being employed by the wealthier members of the town to produce these decorative plaster ceilings.
Yeah, it sounds entirely plausible. Thank you for that. I think this is probably a two-pint discussion. I'll perhaps join you somewhere and be in the chair.
Right.
think that's probably it then, Barry, unless there is any last minute questions
Well,
or comments.
Well, I thank you all for coming and for supporting the Derbyshire Historic Buildings Trust. I hope some of you will take up the opportunity to go to the Dickens event in Hopkinson's house. And as Lucy said, it's a wonderful opportunity to actually see part of the interior, apart from the pleasure of listening to expert exposition of Dickens' great stories.
Thank you, Barry, and thank you for an excellent presentation. If anyone isn't already signed up to our mailing list, please do so, and hopefully early next year we'll be sending out our programme for 2023. So wish you all a very Merry Christmas and hopefully see you next year. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you, Barry. That was lovely. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks again, Barry.